Thank you very much for inviting me to present my paper through video. I'm the Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute, Naoyuki Yoshino. Today, I would like to talk about the importance of infrastructure, especially focusing on connectivity and spillover effects. This diagram shows, suppose a railway is completed along these two cities. Then we will see the connectivity between other regions are very important, not only just producing this railway, but also connectivity is very important in infrastructure investment. And that applies not only to domestic connectivity, but also across the nations. Secondly, the infrastructure investment itself is not so important. How to bring spillover effects along this highway, railway, and infrastructures are very important in order to develop the region. And infrastructure has two big different impacts. One is direct effect. Construction of infrastructure itself increases output. But spillover effects or indirect effects are much more important. Those infrastructure investment, railway, highway, ports, will bring private economic activities in the region that is represented by KP, and then it will increase employment into the region. So yellow and green portions are spillover effects or indirect effects. And usually when the infrastructure is constructed, the investors will receive the rate of return coming from toll fees. However, if these toll fees are increased by the increment of these spillover effects, then the rate of return would become much higher, and bankable projects will become much more. So in this presentation, I would like to propose the returns for the investors for infrastructure is not only coming from toll revenues, but also the spillover effects of the region that will increase tax revenues in those regions. And part of those tax revenues can be returned to the investors for infrastructure. And that will increase the rate of return and bankable projects. And this is one of the examples. I'm using Japanese infrastructure investment. First row is direct effect. And second row is indirect effect coming through private economic activities. And third row is coming from creation of employment. Then suppose 20% of GDP is taxed, corporate tax and income tax. Suppose all of those tax revenues be returned to the investors, how much it will increase the rate of return. As you can see here, during high growth period, about 43.8% the rate of return would have increased. And even recently, 33% or 34% can be increased by bringing those tax revenues to the investors. And these tax revenues can be used to cross-border infrastructure investment. And this is one example, and this region is northeastern part of India. Highway and railway has to go through Bangladesh to get to large port or city. And this infrastructure first initially will create lots of benefits to northeastern part of India. Then spillover effects will increase regional activities and tax revenues will be increased. And suppose these tax revenues are returned to Bangladesh, part of it, 20 or 30%. Then Bangladesh can use those money into the development of after the completion of cross-border highway and railway. And this is the Uzbekistan's case. And we have looked at a railway of Uzbekistan. And then we found out there are three different stages of impacts. One is regional impact along those railways. Then adjacent regions of spillover effects and then after that, connectivity effect. So railway has three different impacts. Railway, and then spillover to the region, and then adjacent regions, and after the completion of connectivity, that will have much bigger impact in all over the places. So this econometric method shows after the connectivity has been completed, then impact became much, much bigger. And then suppose 20% of those tax revenues coming from spillover would have been used to the increment of rate of return to investors, then 16% or 14.7% of the rate of return would have been increased. And this is a case of Japanese bullet train. Again, the completion of the railway was 2004, but first 6 years there aren't so much impact. But after 2011, the connectivity of the region has been completed to large cities. Then the impact had become very large. And as you can see here, after the connection with large cities had been completed, then the tax revenues in the region drastically increased. And this is a case of Philippines highway. And this is a Tagalog-Alteria road. And we have looked at the impact of those highways compared to other regions. If this slope is very high, that means highway had a very significant impact. And this shows after the connectivity with other roads has been completed, business tax, regulatory fees, and property tax revenue has been increased into the region. This is Batangas City's tax revenues. T-1 and T0 is the construction period. And tax revenue has increased during construction period. But after the completion of highway, tax revenue has diminished. And it takes 3 years or 4 years, total revenue of the tax has been significantly increased because connectivity has been created and also private businesses has to set up business very well. So after the 4th year, the tax revenue went up almost twice. That means the impact increased enormously. Lastly, I would like to talk about the regional disparities of infrastructure investment. And there are lots of differences in the same unit of money have different impacts. And these are the impacts where connectivity and spillover effects are very large. And then 20% of the tax revenues are returned to the investors. About 37% the rate of return will have increased. That will create much more bankable projects. Lastly, I will talk about financing of these infrastructures. There are 5 ways to finance infrastructure. Using taxpayers' money. Secondly, postal savings or post-life insurance can be used. Or pension funds and insurance, domestic investors fund can be used. And overseas financial aid or overseas investors' money and ODA. And too much reliance on tax revenue will create budget deficits. And also the long-term investments will be needed for infrastructure investment. And bank deposits are usually very short, 2 to 5 years. But life insurance, pension funds can create much longer maturity. So for investment for infrastructure finance and investment, long-term financing like life insurance and pension funds are required domestically to increase portion of domestic financing. However, in many Asian regions, deposits are dominating, and insurance and pension funds are very small except for Japan, Singapore. So I think Asia requires long-term investment and spillover effects and connectivity between the regions to other regions are very important for infrastructure investment. This will end my presentation. Thank you very much.